In 1990, the town of Millfield, Alabama was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen. It was small and quiet. People left their doors unlocked. Children rode their bikes until the sun went down. Neighbors waved at each other every morning. Everyone believed they were safe. Millfield had one main road, a few stores, a high school, and a police station with only a handful of officers. Big crimes happened in big cities, not in towns like this. That was what people believed. Then one day in the spring of 1990, everything changed. That morning started like any other. People went to work. Students went to school. The air was warm and the sky was clear. No one knew that by the end of the day, the town would be filled with fear, confusion, and heartbreak. That afternoon, police received a call that would stay with them for decades. A young woman named Sarah Mitchell had been found dead near a wooded area just outside town. She was 21 years old. She had lived in Millfield her whole life. People knew her. They had watched her grow up. She worked at a local grocery store and planned to start college in the fall. When police cars arrived, flashing red and blue lights lit up the trees. Officers blocked off the area. Word spread fast. People gathered nearby, whispering and crying. Some could not believe it. Others refused to accept it was real. Sarah was gone. For a town that had never experienced a violent crime like this, the shock was deep. Parents rushed home to check on their children. Schools ended early. Doors were locked that night for the first time in years. The police began their investigation right away. They searched the area carefully. They collected what evidence they could find. They took photographs. They wrote notes. They spoke to anyone who might have seen something. But in 1990, police did not have the tools they have today. There were no security cameras nearby. There were no cell phone records to track. DNA testing existed, but it was limited and slow. Many labs could not test small samples properly. The police depended heavily on witness statements. They asked where Sarah had been that day, who she had spoken to, if anyone noticed something strange. Some people thought they remembered seeing her walking alone. Others were not sure. Memories were unclear. Fear made people second-guess themselves. The police followed every lead they could. They spoke to friends. They spoke to coworkers. They spoke to neighbors. A few people were questioned more than once. Some rumors spread, but none of them turned into solid proof. Weeks passed, then months. No arrest was made. As time went on, the investigation slowed. Not because the police did not care, but because they had nothing new to work with. Every lead had been checked. Every witness had been interviewed. The case became what police call a cold case. For Sarah's family, the pain never faded. They woke up every day hopping for answers. They went to sleep every night feeling the same sadness. Holidays were hard. Birthdays were harder. Life continued, but something was always missing. The town of Millfield also changed. People were still kind, but they were more careful. Parents worried more. Teenagers were warned to stay in groups. The feeling of safety was gone. Years passed. New families moved into town. Some people moved away. Children who were young in 1990 grew up and had families of their own. But the story of Sarah Mitchell was never forgotten. People talked about it quietly. Some believed the person responsible had left town. Others believed the truth would never come out. Many lost hope. The evidence from the case sat in boxes. It was stored in a room that few people visited. Dust gathered, papers aged. The case waited. Then decades later, something changed. In the late 2010s, a detective named Daniel Brooks joined the county sheriff's department. He believed old cases still mattered. He believed families deserved answers, no matter how much time had passed. When he reviewed cold cases, Sarah Mitchell's file caught his attention. He read everything, every report, every note, every photograph. He noticed things that others had not because they were careless, but because they did not have today's technology. One small piece of evidence stood out. It had been tested in 1990, but the results were unclear. At the time, there was nothing more police could do. Now there was. Detective Brooks sent the evidence to a modern lab. DNA testing had improved greatly. Databases were larger. Matches could be found that were impossible before. Weeks passed. Then the lab called. They had a match. The DNA belonged to a man named Robert Hayes. Robert Hayes had lived in Millfield in 1990. He was known in the community. He had worked nearby. He had never been arrested for a serious crime. His name had never stood out during the original investigation. That was why the news was so shocking. Detective Brooks began digging into Robert Hayes's past. He found that Hayes had moved away shortly after Sarah's death. He had lived a quiet life since then. To many people, he was just a normal man. The detective spoke to people who remembered 1990. Some were hesitant at first. Others were emotional. Slowly, new details came out. Things people had brushed aside years ago suddenly seemed important. Hayes had been seen near the area where Sarah was found. He had given strange answers when questioned back then, but without proof, police could not act. Now they could. Police worked carefully. They did not rush. They wanted the case to be strong. They wanted justice, not doubt. Finally, one morning, officers went to Robert Hayes's home. They knocked on the door. They explained why they were there. He was arrested without resistance. When the news reached Millfield, the town was stunned. People could not believe it. Robert Hayes was not a stranger. Some had known him. Some had worked with him. Some had trusted him. The arrest shocked the community because it showed something painful and frightening. The person responsible had not been some unknown outsider. He had been someone familiar. For Sarah's family, the arrest brought many emotions: relief, anger, sadness, pain, but also answers. After nearly 30 years, the waiting was over. The case showed the power of time, technology, and persistence. It proved that the truth does not disappear just because years pass. And it reminded everyone in Millfield that justice, even when delayed, still matters. As you think about this story, ask yourself this: how many other answers are still waiting to be found, hidden in old files, just waiting for someone to look again? After the arrest of Robert Hayes, the town of Millfield did not feel real anymore. People woke up the next morning and went through their routines, but everything felt heavier. Conversations stopped when someone walked into a room. Neighbors looked at each other differently. The arrest had opened wounds that never fully healed. News trucks arrived in town. Reporters stood outside the old police station. They asked questions people were not ready to answer. Many residents avoided the cameras. Others spoke quietly, still trying to understand how someone they had once known could be connected to such a terrible crime. For years, people believed the person responsible for Sarah Mitchell's death was long gone. They imagined a stranger who passed through town and disappeared forever. The truth was much harder to accept. The suspect had been part of their community. He had lived among them. He had smiled at them. He had blended in. That realization made people feel unsafe all over again. Sarah's family was taken to a private room at the sheriff's office. A detective sat with them and explained what had happened. He spoke slowly. He chose his words carefully. He knew no explanation could ever take away their pain. They learned how the evidence had been retested, how new technology had made it possible to find a match, how the investigation had been rebuilt piece by piece. They cried together. They held hands. They felt relief but also anger. For almost 30 years they had lived without answers. They had wondered if justice would ever come. Now it had, but it was late. Very late. The arrest also brought back memories for the town. People remembered where they were in 1990 when they first heard the news. They remembered the fear. They remembered parents checking windows and locking doors. They remembered how quiet the town became. Some people felt guilty. They wondered if they had missed something back then, if they had seen something but stayed silent, if they had trusted the wrong person. Others felt defensive. They said there was no way anyone could have known. Life had been different then. Information moved slower. Police had fewer tools. Both feelings were real. As the days passed, more details came out. Court documents explained how the DNA evidence had been preserved, how it sat untouched for years because the science was not ready, how one decision to reopen the case changed everything. Detective Brooks spoke publicly only once. He said the case was never forgotten. It had simply been waiting, waiting for the right moment, waiting for the right tools. He reminded people that cold cases are not dead cases. They are stories paused in time. Robert Hayes was moved to a county jail. He did not speak to the media. His face appeared briefly on the news, older and thinner than people remembered. Seeing him like that made the crime feel real again. For teenagers in Millfield, the story felt confusing. They had grown up hearing about Sarah Mitchell as a warning, almost like a legend. Now it was real. The person responsible had a name, a face, a history. Teachers spoke carefully in class. Parents had long talks with their children. Some families visited Sarah's grave for the first time in years. The weeks after the arrest felt long and heavy. Time seemed to slow down in Millfield. Every day, people waited for more news. They checked the local paper. They watched the evening news. They talked quietly at work and at school. The case was no longer just a memory from the past. It was happening now. Police began preparing for court. They reviewed every piece of evidence again. They wanted to be careful. They knew the defense would question why it took so long. They knew people would ask if mistakes had been made years ago. Detective Brooks spent many late nights at his desk. He read the old reports again and again. He compared them to the new evidence. He wanted to make sure the story made sense from beginning to end. He thought about the officers who worked the case in 1990. Many of them were retired now. Some had passed away. They had done the best they could with what they had. He respected them for that. The truth was simple. Back then, the science was not ready. Now it was. The prosecutor met with Sarah Mitchell's family several times. He explained the process step by step. He told them what to expect. He did not make promises. He knew the law could be slow and complicated. Sarah's parents listened quietly. They asked questions when they needed to. They had learned patience the hard way. For them, the arrest was not the end of the story. It was another hard chapter. They would have to hear details they had avoided for years. They would have to face the person accused of taking their daughter's life. But they also knew this was the only way forward. As the case moved toward court, people in Millfield began sharing memories. Some remembered seeing Sarah the week she died. Others remembered Robert Hayes from years ago. Small details surfaced. Nothing dramatic, just pieces of life from a time long past. One woman remembered Hayes standing outside the grocery store late one evening. Another man remembered him leaving town suddenly not long after the crime. At the time, none of it seemed important. Now it did. Teenagers in the town asked their parents questions. They wanted to understand how something like this could happen in a place that felt so safe. Parents struggled to answer. Some admitted they had trusted too easily. Others said danger does not always announce itself. School counselors were made available. Teachers reminded students it was okay to feel confused or upset. Even though the crime happened long ago, the emotions were new for many young people. The day of the first court hearing arrived quietly. There were no crowds shouting, no loud protests, just people standing outside the courthouse waiting. Sarah's family walked in together. They held each other's hands. They did not look at the cameras. Robert Hayes was brought in wearing plain clothes and handcuffs. He kept his head down. Some people in the room recognized him. Others felt sick seeing his face for the first time. The judge spoke calmly. The charges were read. The room was silent. For many people, this was the moment it became real. Not just a story on the news, not just a headline, but a real case with real people. As the legal process continued, more information was shared with the public. The DNA evidence was explained in simple terms. Experts described how samples that once seemed useless could now be tested in deeper ways. They explained how databases connected cases across states and years. People listened carefully. Some were amazed. Others were angry it had taken so long, but most understood one thing clearly. Without modern technology, this arrest would never have happened. The community began talking about other unsolved cases. People wondered how many answers were still waiting, how many families were still hopping. Millfield was no longer just a town with a tragic past. It became an example of persistence. For Sarah's parents, each court date was painful. They heard their daughter's name spoken again and again. They heard details they wished they could forget, but they stayed strong. They said they were doing this for Sarah. They wanted her story to be told truthfully. As months passed, the case continued to move forward. Slowly, carefully, justice does not rush. It takes its time, especially when the past is involved. People in Millfield learned to live with the waiting again, but this time it was different. This time there was direction, there was purpose. They were no longer waiting in the dark. And even though nothing could bring Sarah Mitchell back, the town felt something it had not felt in a long time. A sense that the truth, no matter how late, still mattered. The trial took place many months after the arrest. By then, the town of Millfield had learned how to live with the weight of the case being reopened. People still talked about it, but not in whispers anymore. It was part of daily life now, something everyone carried with them. On the first day of the trial, the courthouse was quiet. People filled the benches slowly. Some were there out of support for Sarah's family. Others came because they wanted to understand how something like this could happen in their town. Sarah's parents arrived early. They sat in the front row. They did not look around much. They focused on each other and on the floor in front of them. This moment had been waiting for them for almost 30 years. Robert Hayes was brought into the room by deputies. He looked smaller than people remembered, older. His hair was gray. His shoulders were bent. Time had changed him, but it had not erased the past. The judge entered and the room stood still. The trial began. The prosecutor spoke first. He told the jury this was not just a case about a crime. It was a case about time, about patience, about the truth waiting for science to catch up. He explained what happened in 1990. He described Sarah Mitchell as a young woman with plans and dreams. He spoke clearly and carefully, knowing that every word mattered. The defense spoke next. They focused on the years that had passed. They questioned memories. They questioned why no arrest was made back then. They said time made the case weak. The jury listened. Over the next several days, witnesses took the stand. Some were older now. Their voices shook as they spoke. They remembered things they had not thought about in years, small moments, passing conversations, strange feelings they could never explain. Experts explained the DNA evidence. They showed how the technology worked. They explained how it was impossible to get the same match by accident. They spoke slowly, making sure everyone understood. The courtroom was silent as they talked. When Sarah's parents were asked to speak, the room felt heavy. Her mother talked about who Sarah was, not just how she died, but how she lived, her laugh, her kindness, her dreams. Her father spoke about the years of waiting, the birthdays spent visiting a grave, the pain of not knowing. There were tears in the room. Even people who had never met Sarah felt the loss. Robert Hayes did not testify. He sat quietly, his eyes often fixed on the table. Some people tried to read his face. Others could not bring themselves to look at him at all. After closing arguments, the jury left to decide. The waiting began again. Hours passed. People sat in silence. Some prayed, some cried, some stared at the clock. When the jury returned, everyone stood. The verdict was read. Guilty. Sarah's mother covered her face and cried. Her father closed his eyes and let out a long breath he had been holding for decades. People in the courtroom felt a mix of relief and sadness. Justice had finally arrived, but it came with reminders of everything that had been lost. Robert Hayes was sentenced. The judge spoke firmly. He acknowledged the time that had passed. He acknowledged the pain. He said no sentence could undo what was done, but accountability mattered. When it was over, the courtroom emptied slowly. Outside, the air felt different, lighter in some ways, heavier in others. Sarah's family spoke briefly to the press. They thanked the investigators. They thanked the community. They said they could finally begin to heal. The town of Millfield did not celebrate. This was not a victory. It was a closing of a wound that had been open for too long. In the months that followed, the town changed quietly. People talked more openly. They supported each other. They remembered Sarah not just as a victim, but as a person. The police department reviewed other old cases. The story of Sarah Mitchell reminded them that answers could still be found. Teenagers learned about the case in school, not as a warning filled with fear, but as a lesson about truth, patience, and justice. Millfield would always carry the memory of 1990, but now it also carried something else. Proof that even after decades of silence, the truth can still speak. And when it does, it can change everything.